After studying this module, you shall be able to know the concept of authenticity, learn the conceptual paradigm and perspectives on authenticity, and understand the importance of authenticity. Introduction. Both positive psychology and humanistic psychology promote the ideals of psychological well-being and fulfillment of individual potential. Both these approaches share a commitment for the development of human potential and support positive mental states, personal strengths, and moral virtues that lead to happiness and well-being. However, both these schools have been critical of the others' approaches and theoretical perspectives. The disagreement is a result of how one interprets human flourishing and optimal development. That is, how we identify the human good with authentic happiness and fulfillment. Humanistic psychology and the existential phenomenological approach define the fundamental human good in terms of the principle of authenticity. Positive psychology is less clear about the priority given to authenticity as a core value. It tends to add an explicitly ethical dimension to the notion of authentic happiness. Authentically happy individuals, according to Seligman, are those who develop their distinctive talents and strength and who live a life of higher meaning and purpose. Extensive research within positive psychology has established the importance of personal autonomy and authenticity as fundamental components of human fulfillment and happiness. Within positive psychology, there is not a clear consensus with regard to how to define the self and therefore much less for authentic self.
The term authenticity is quite vague. The concept of authenticity has its roots in Greek philosophy. To thine own self be true. Evolio and Gardner 2005. Peterson and Seligman 2004 offer the following account of the nature of the self and authenticity. The nature of the self has been variedly defined. The self is a mental projection of the underlying organism, an online simulation being run within the biocognitive computer. Kuhn and Ghosh 1994. The self is the lived character in an unfolding personal drama. McAdams 1999. The self is that is constantly updated. DeMezzo 1999. The self is a phenomenal fiction, both in that the content of the regnant self narrative can be somewhat arbitrary or randomly determined, and in that the self narrative may be inaccurate or even inaccurate stimulation of the underlying organism's actual condition. Sheldon and Elliott, 1999. According to Berger and Luckman, 1967, authentic self is a constructed narrative developed through interactions with significant others and measured by the degree of congruence between the person's actual experience and their self representation. It draws attention to the importance of congruence between the organism's actual flow of experience, needs, emotions, and interests, and the way that experience is represented in the self system. Authentic selfhood is defined in terms of the ideal self towards which the individual strives and the clarity of the value commitments associated with that ideal. Taylor, 1989-1999. Authenticity can also be defined as a value orientation applied in the primary instance to individual selfhood and, by extension, to relationships, institutions, organizations, and communities. It describes a way of being that includes an orientation towards an ideal higher self based on a defined set of values freely chosen by the individual through self defining existential decisions and commitments, grounded in here and now, awareness of the inner flow of experience, an expression of personal autonomy vis-a-vis external societal incentives and constraints, negotiated through a dialogical process within cultural contexts with significant others, coherent, integrative, and congruent self narrative constructed from the perspectives of self and others. Authenticity needs to be considered as a unifying principle of a general ethical orientation towards life. Taylor, 1999. The authentic self can be viewed as a co creation of self and others engaged in a dialogical process where individuals are able to own and affirm their authentic selves based on awareness of all of the above dimensions. Conceptual paradigms and developing perspectives. The dominant philosophical paradigms governing the development of humanistic and positive psychology converged during the period of the 1970s to 1990s. Authenticity represents the focal point of that convergence. Three distinct movements came together to define an ethic of authenticity that would integrate these two traditions in psychology. Those include a. The shift in the field of phenomenology from the focus on individual consciousness to that of the socially constructed life world. Herbams, 1987. B. The emergence of virtue ethics and communitarian social theory. McIntyre, 1984. Taylor, 1989. C. The emergence of a constructive developmental framework within psychology for representing self development. Kagan, 1982. D. The emergence of positive psychology as a distinct psychological orientation. Seligman, 2002. The existential tradition focused on how individuals construct meaning in opposition to the constraints of society and culture. It focused on the inherent conflicts between the ideals of freedom and self actualization and the requirements of social conformity and the maintenance of socially defined power structures on the other. Foucault, 1980, 1997, Niche, 1969. The primary impetus for the development of existential and humanistic psychologies grew out of this paradigm with a focus on depth psychology and self actualization. This paradigm failed to provide an adequate account of the social context of self development and the quest for authenticity, nor did it provide an adequate account of the nature of our ethical responsibilities and obligations towards others and towards society. Browning, 1987, Olsen, 1967. It remained an individually focused philosophy and focused primarily on the individual's quest to define meaning and value. This conceptual paradigm changed fundamentally during the late 70s through the 90s, with phenomenology it was recognized that the socially constructed life world was the source of meaning, purpose, and values, and the individuality was a task to be accomplished within a predefined social matrix. Berger and Luckman, 1967, Herms, 1987, Sartre, 1963. Within this new paradigm, authenticity needed to be reconsidered as a process of differentiation of the individual within the family or the community, rather than as an oppositional struggle between the individual and the society. At the same time, a communitarian movement in ethics and social theory emerged during the 1980s. This movement shared the notion of the priority of the social and focused on the balance between personal autonomy and authenticity, and the need for social order and shared meaning and purpose on the other. Representatives of this movement were found in the area of virtue ethics, Macklin 1984, Taylor 1989, and in social political philosophy, Giovanni 1995, 1996, Hermus 1989. These various movements shared an understanding that the individual existed in a social context. The emergence of constructivist interpretations of the self and the process of meaning making emerged as a new conceptual paradigm. Kagan 1982. One of the most important of these is Kagan's The Evolving Self: Problems and Process in Human Development 1982. Kagan proposed a third way in psychology that superseded the traditions of dynamic and existential psychology and cognitive behavioral psychology. It was the constructive developmental framework, the social construction of reality and the self. In particular, the notion of authentic self is viewed as socially constructed out of the patterns and interpretations of interpersonal interactions and the appropriation of cultural traditions of meaning, value, and purpose. This includes the early childhood issues of attachment and individuation through which the child develops a core sense of self, as well as the stages of late adolescence and early adulthood, where individuals critically evaluate the value frameworks of their culture and appropriate those frameworks as their own, as defining their authentic selves. It was within this intellectual environment that positive psychology emerged. Drawing on the cognitive behavioral framework, authenticity has long been recognized as the cardinal virtue of the humanistic psychology, but it lacked a fully developed account of the nature of our ethical obligations and responsibilities towards the society. Positive psychology has recognized the importance of moral virtues and related strengths as constituents of authentic happiness, but has not provided an account of how individuals integrate this ethical dimension into their life. The ethic of authenticity bridges this gap by demonstrating how the authentic self is a creation of the individual through defining a fundamental value orientation, making ethical decisions, cultivating self awareness, acting autonomously, thinking critically, and being open to the views of others. The challenge of positive psychology is to embrace this constructivist interpretation of the self and the ethic of authenticity and refine the normative framework that it shares with humanistic psychology. Seligman 2002, in his book Authentic Happiness, classifies positive emotions into three categories: those associated with the past, the present, and the future. Positive emotions associated with the future include optimism, hope, confidence, faith, and trust. Those associated with the past include satisfaction, contentment, fulfillment, pride, and serenity. There are two distinct classes of positive emotions concerned with the present: momentary pleasures and more enduring gratifications. These pleasures include both bodily pleasures and higher pleasures. Bodily pleasures come through the senses. As conceptualized within the emerging field of positive psychology, Seligman 2002, authenticity can be defined as owning one's personal experiences, be they thoughts, emotions, needs, preferences, or beliefs, processes, captured by the injunction to know oneself and behaving in accordance with the true self. Hara 2002. Authenticity as a construct dates back to the time of ancient Greeks. Although the concept of authenticity is not new, there has been a resurging interest in what constitutes authentic leadership. Authentic leadership is a somewhat generic term and can incorporate transformational, charismatic, servant, spiritual, or other forms of positive leadership. Evolio and Gardner 2005. The term authentic has particular connotations may lead us to conclude that it is perhaps a superior or more genuine form of leadership. The development of authentic leadership stems from positive organizational behavior and positive organizational context, which reflect human resource strengths and psychological capacities that can be measured, developed, and effectively managed for performance improvement in today's workplace. Novice, Davis, Dawn, Buckley, and Brown 2005. Luthans and Evolio 2003 initially defined authentic leadership as a process that draws from both positive psychological capacities and a highly developed organizational context, which results in both greater self awareness and self regulated positive behaviors on the part of leaders and associates, fostering positive self development. Authentic leaders exemplify high moral standards, integrity, honesty. They acknowledge their personal limitations and shortcomings and are therefore less likely to adopt a defensive attitude about organizational problems. Seung 2012. Authentic leadership is more than just a style of leadership. It involves more than just feeling good because one is true to oneself. However, defining it accurately presents a challenge because it greatly depends on perception. At its core, it is comprised of moral behavior based on values that align with others and the organization. It is continually evolving through relationships with peers and followers. To be an authentic leader, one must be true to oneself as it relates to the collective good of others and be ethically accountable. The ideal of authenticity is important not only from the point of the individual but also for the vision of a healthy, growth oriented, and innovative society. The twin values of autonomy and authenticity are cornerstones of a democratic society. The emerging communitarian ethic recognizes that respect for both autonomy and diversity are important components of a healthy and a vibrant culture. Giovanni, 1996. The ideal of authenticity is also important for defining the normative framework of positive psychology. The principles of community, virtue, and rationality are all relevant to this normative framework. To know oneself and act accordingly has been a moral imperative throughout history. Hara 2002. Within humanistic and existential psychology, individual differences in authenticity have been considered critically important to understanding well being and freedom from psychopathology. Rogers, 1959, 1964, 1980, Callum, 1980. However, the study of authenticity has largely been neglected in empirical psychology, and there have been no direct and psychometrically valid measures of trait authenticity yet developed. Sheldon, 2004. Peterson and Seligman, 2004, noted that most people agree that integrity, authenticity, and honesty are basic human strengths, but the psychological database is spotty, and Harter 2002 concluded that there is no single coherent body of literature on authentic self behavior, no bedrock of knowledge. The recent positive psychology movement has encouraged interest in authenticity. For the study of authenticity to progress, there seems to be a need to identify and quantify authenticity as an individual difference variable. There is also a need for a direct test of the hypothesis that the authentic personality is related to well being.
Number one, positive psychology, humanistic psychology share a commitment to the ideals of psychological well-being and the fulfillment of individual potential. Number two, humanistic psychology and the related existential phenomenological approach to the study of human behavior define the fundamental human good in terms of the principle of authenticity. Number three, positive psychology is somewhat less clear about the priority given to the authenticity as a core value. It tends to add an explicitly ethical dimension to the notion of authentic happiness. 4. The concept of authenticity has its roots in Greek philosophy. 5th, authentic self is a truth narrative developed through interactions with significant others and measured by the degree of congruence between the person's actual experiences and their self representation. Fifth, authentic selfhood is defined in terms of the ideal self towards which the individual strives and the clarity of the value commitment associated with their ideal. Seventh, the dominant philosophical paradigm that governed the development of humanistic and positive psychology converged during the period of the late 1970s and 1990s, and that the ethic of authenticity represent the focal point of that convergence. 8. Seligman, in his book Authentic Happiness, classifies positive emotions into three categories: those associated with the past, the present, and the future. 9. Authentic leadership is a somewhat generic term and can incorporate transformational, charismatic, servant spiritual, or other forms of positive leadership. 10. The development of authentic leadership stems from positive organizational behavior and positive organizational context. 10. The ideal of authenticity is important not only from the point of individual but also from the vision of the healthy, growth oriented and innovative society, and also for defining the normative framework of positive psychology.